where do we start in terms of making sense of the labor condition in a structural political sense in, let's say, the Indian economy? Now, let me begin with one very simple number, which will help you understand the difficulties associated with labor absorption in this country, which is at the root cause of many other things. So if you look at 1980s as a decade, as per the official data sources used by everybody, the rate of labor absorption in 1980s was approximately 2% per annum. So every year, approximately 2% of those who wanted to be part of the workforce got absorbed. Now, if, let's say, the rate of population growth or workforce growth is approximately 2.5% and 2% is getting absorbed, you only have a problem with, let's say, the 0.5%, right? What happens during 1990s? It comes down to half of that. 2% becomes half a percent. Half of 2%, sorry, so 1%, right? In fact, in 1990s, during the second half, it had become as low as 0.6%, right? And the secular trend continues with some shifts during shorter periods. So you notice that during 2005-6 to about 10-11, there is an improvement in labor absorption. Right? So there is an upward shift in that sense. However, it never goes back to the 1980s level. Right? I'm using 1980s as a benchmark to understand the period before economic reforms in this country, right? When a whole host of policies came into being. I'm sure some of these have already been discussed, but if there is anything, then we can get into that later in the conversation. What has happened during the last 7 years or so, 7-8 years or so, if you look at that, and the standard data sources which come from National Sample Survey Organization, now that has been merged with the National Statistical Office. If you look at that, okay, then the period after 10-11 was one of not only any positive labor absorption, but actually labor shedding. So if you look at, from the standard data sources, if you go up to 15-16, that is the story. That's, if you had, let's say, 100 workers in the economy who were working, it comes down to 98, 97, 93, 94, that sort of story. In other words, what was happening from early 90s was a push towards jobless growth. What happens subsequently is job loss growth. Growth is happening. No jobs are being created. And here, when we talk of jobs, we are talking of all kinds of jobs: self-employment, paid employment, regular employment, casual employment, whole host of jobs that we can visualize and think about. So we are talking of the huge proportion of workers who are doing their own things, right? So we have data on self-employment, etc. So this is something which is a very stark feature, right? Essentially, in the language of economists, there is a very simple idea called elasticity of employment, which measures for every unit of growth what is the job that is being created. Now, that elasticity of employment has been going down continuously, right? And now, as I mentioned earlier, we are in a situation where there is, in fact, labor shedding instead of labor absorption, right? This is one number that will help you understand many aspects of the structural challenges that we confront, which I will elaborate. तो बेसिकली जो इलास्टिसिटी वाली बात जो थी, तो लगातार वो गिरती गई है कि अगर 1% पहले ग्रोथ होता था और एक रोजगार का सृजन हो जाता था, तो अब रोजगार का सृजन जो है वो एक की बजाय आधा हो गया, आधे की बजाय चौथाई हो गया, चौथाई की बजाय तकरीबन 0 पे पहुंच गया। तो ये स्थिति हो गई। तो इलास्टिसिटी, जो एम्प्लॉयमेंट इलास्टिसिटी जिसको कहते हैं, रोजगार का सृजन होने की जो बात है, उस पर बहुत जबरदस्त प्रेशर आया इस पूरे दौर में। और ये स्थिति जो है कमोबेश सारे विश्व की है, तो इसको समझना होगा। इसी संदर्भ में एक और मैं आपको आंकड़ा दे दूं कि अगर आप सबसे जो हाल का पीरियड है, जो एनडीए 2 और एनडीए 3 वाला, अगर उसको देखें और थोड़ा इसको देखें कि क्या हुआ बेरोजगारी को लेकर, तो 11-12 के जो आंकड़े हैं, उस समय जो सरकारी मेजरमेंट है कि हमारे यहाँ कितनी बेरोजगारी है, जो काफी अंडर एस्टिमेट करती है अपने आप को, बेरोजगारी को अपने आप में। लेकिन मैं उसमें नहीं जाऊंगा, इन तकनीकी विषयों में नहीं जाऊंगा। ये मान के चलिए कि चलिए वो हमें एक तरह का इंडिकेशन देता है, सरकारी आंकड़ा जो है बेरोजगारी और रोजगार, इन सब चीजों को लेकर। इस पे बहुत सारे विवाद हैं, बहुत प्रश्न उठते हैं, लेकिन उसमें हम लोग ना जाएं। ये मान के चलें कि चलिए कमोबेश हमें एक तस्वीर दिखा रहा है। अगर हम उसको देखें तो जो 10-11 में जो बेरोजगारी की दर थी, 18-19 तक आते आते वो 3 गुना उससे बढ़ गई, यानी 300%, 3 गुना। और पिछले 45 साल का ये जो है, जब से इसी अपने तौर तरीके से, इसी मेथोडोलॉजी का इस्तेमाल करते हुए, सॉरी मैं हिंदी में बोलने लग गया, अपॉलॉजीज, ओके, यूजिंग द सेम methodology, the data that we are collecting from early 1970s to what we have continued with some small changes in methodology at particular junctures, but let me not get into those details again. We can say that it is comparable by and large. What we find is that between 11-12 and 17-18, 18-19, the increase was threefold, which had never happened in Indian economy, never. And from the time that this kind of information is getting collected, it is highest ever. That is during the last almost half a century. This is the highest rate of unemployment. Let me again remind you that we are, in terms of our methodology, not quite capturing all kinds of unemployment. We are very liberal in counting people as employed. But as I said, I will not get into these details unless we have some questions later. So this will also then help you understand the kind of broad trajectory. All these numbers are from the official sources. And the last number which I want to give you, rural India, where, as you know, overwhelming majority of the country resides. Workforce may be less than 50% now employed in agriculture. But if you look at those who are residing in rural India, it is almost about 2/3 of this particular country. So if you add agriculture, non-agricultural workforce, we are talking of, very, very substantial, as I said, close to 2/3 and so on. What I want to highlight is that during, again, the same period which I mentioned earlier, 11-12 and 18-19, during this period, per capita consumption in rural India, as per official data source, declined by 9 percentage points. Per capita consumption in rural India declined by 9 percentage points. This is unprecedented since independence. There have been some years where for 1 year there was a marginal decline, then the next year it improved. But for a block of a quinquennium, 5-6 years, this is an unprecedented figure. Now, this again has a lot to do with what is happening to employment generation, what is happening to other areas of economic processes, activities, and so on. But since our conversation, I'm focusing much more on employment and work and working conditions and so on. Now, please take these three different figures together, and that would convey a very, very powerful and very distressing kind of story that we need to try and understand. Yeah. That is, when it comes to decline in consumption for a whole lot of people who constitute the working class, even a 1 or 2 or 3% decline can make a difference between life and death. If you add the COVID years in this conversation, you can realize, but you see, we also need to keep in mind that the COVID years, I mean, this COVID period of year and a half, slightly more, is one which is a very, very unusual period and full with all kinds of difficulties. And that's why I'm not giving you figures from the last roughly 2 years or so. Yeah, if you factor those in, then the things are much worse. So just to give you one simple indicator, as per the institute which looks at multidimensional poverty, this is Oxford Institute, it reported that between, let's say, 2004-5 and just before COVID, we had a situation where basically most of it is during UPA 1 and UPA 2, official count of poor had come down by almost 260 million, right? And just during the COVID period, this entire gain has been wiped out, as per the Oxford Institute, which looks at the Indian data and has generated this number. In less than 2 years, this entire gain has been wiped out. Right? So let's not get too much into the COVID discussion. I imagine we'll have some other session, some other occasion to get into those. So essentially, the core argument which I tried to share with you is that in the recent few decades, 4 to 5 decades, the structural conditions of workers, their employment, their possibilities have come under huge pressure. Even though growth rate has witnessed some increase. So the obvious question to ask is, what is the point of a growth rate of 8%, which does not absorb anyone, compared to a growth rate of 4% per annum, which at least absorbs 1 to 2% of workers? This is a key question which you have to keep in mind. In other words, the structure of growth is very intimately connected with the structure of livelihood generation, employment generation, and so on. Okay. So for countries like India, for developing world in general, for global South in general, it is extremely important to keep this question of structure of growth and structure of labor absorption processes at the center stage. What neoliberalism has done, although a few things were happening even before neoliberalism came to dominate the overall policy making discourse everywhere, but and I'll flag just 1 or 2 things. We don't have too much time to get into those issues. But with neoliberalism, that structure of growth was altered massively through a number of policies. Labor absorption tended to come down and so on, even though the growth itself did not come down. We can do decade by decade or quinquennium by quinquennium. So there are some shifts, some Sometimes it also, even growth goes down a little bit compared to 1980s, occasionally for 3, 4, 5 years. But on the whole, if we take the entire period, okay, till about 15, 16, growth was not under pressure. Basically, it is after 15, 16 that the growth came under pressure. That is just before the pandemic, the 3, 4 years. And reasons for that, again, are policies of demonetization, policies of GST and so on. But hopefully in some other conversation, you can get into more details of that. Why the immediate 3, 4 years before COVID were absolutely terrible for the Indian economy from the point of view of growth. But then from the point of view of livelihoods and other figures which I gave you, loss of jobs and so on, clearly this had a huge disproportionate kind of impact on the world of work. Right? Now, coming to one or two things about the overall neoliberal policy regime. What does it do? Number one, it leads to a compression of public expenditure. It restructures the role of the state in favor of the powerful, capital in general, against labor, right? Again, all these are very well known and very well documented and widely accepted implications associated with neoliberalism. Conversations you have discussed these, and I'm sure we need not, get into too many details here. However, one point which I want to highlight in this is that from 1970s onwards, what the world has seen is a massive increase in the power of what is known as finance capital. Now, finance capital has been a feature in some sense of all societies. I mean, all economies, etc., from the early days of capitalism and so on. Here, when we are talking about finance capital, we are talking about a certain kind of dominance in its characterization and trait, which is make money only through circulation and not through production. So often it is also described as casino capitalism. The idea is to make money through speculation, right? So if you look at this massive feature of the global economy, and it has happened everywhere. I mean, what I'm saying is that finance capital has emerged as, in the last roughly half a century or so, as the most powerful economic actor in the world. Much more powerful than states, and much more powerful than productive capital, other constituents of capital, and so on. What does it do then? What is the implication of it? Now, if you want to basically make money through the casino activity, there will be a lot of pressure on production happening. But what is the basis of that growth? Much of it is on account of, very large part of it is on account of this kind of speculative basis, right? And that needs to be unpacked and understood carefully. The second very important feature of the global economic system that we have to understand is that, and it has both a plus and a minus, that is, there has been a lot of shift in certain very notable, important economic activities from the north to the south, and these were largely in the north, preserve of the north and so on. So high-tech manufacturing, for instance, right? Apart from manufacturing in general, there has been a lot of kind of shift of manufacturing, even at the cutting edge, from the north to the south, right? And this shift has taken two forms. One is direct investments in these countries, let's say China, South Korea, India, and so on. But much more importantly, it is through incorporating the producers and manufacturers in the South without any shift of capital from the North to the South. Right? So we start supplying to the needs, the tastes, the requirements, the demands of the global North without getting any capital from them as regards the second channel of it. The first, as I mentioned, we also get some foreign direct investments. But the second channel is without getting any investments, we simply get incorporated. So these two extremely important developments that we need to keep in mind in understanding how there has been a massive reconfiguration of global capitalism. So finance capital and what I call fragmentation and decentering of manufacturing, services, and agriculture as well from north to the south in very, very important ways. And very briefly, I explained, I tried to I didn't explain, but I basically put my finger on two kinds of channels and routes. One is through investment, the other is through incorporation without investing anything. And the third thing that we need to take note of, again, during the period of last roughly half a century or so, that this has also meant a massive assault on small production or petty production across the board. That is agriculture, manufacturing, services. In a whole range of activities, you find that there has been destruction or massive weakening of small producers, petty producers, small businesses, and so on. Again, there have been multiple routes and channels through which all this has happened. Now, the net impact of these three: number one, finance capital; number two, this decentering of production; and number three, intensification of the processes of primitive accumulation, right? From the north to the south. All these have resulted in a strange kind of coming together in a synergic fashion. Yeah, there's a lot of very interesting linkages between each one of these, right? These important and major features of contemporary capitalism. Right? We don't have time to get into all the details, but the net impact of all this taken together has been a massive squeeze on prospects of employment. Right? And the last point in this context that I want to flag is all these have got massive boost from this process of what we generally describe as neoliberalism, which has multiple things, multiple policy correlates, dimensions, and so on. But if you want a very, very simple definition, which I have been using in my writings for decades now, a definition of neoliberalism, a one-liner, it is: leave the economy to the market. Market knows the best and market does the best. This is the theology of neoliberalism. How does it happen in terms of concrete policies? There are hundreds of things, and we have to get into details of that. But this is at the core of it. Right? What this theology has done, and I'm using theology on purpose. Right? It's not economics, it's theology. Okay. That market does the best and market knows the best and so on and so forth. And there is huge literature in economic theory which contests this even within the mainstream economics. Okay, so, but I'll not get into these details. So the consequence of all this ascendancy of this theology is all these processes which I mentioned earlier, the three key features which I mentioned earlier from the point of view of implications for the world of work, for the nature of growth, the structure of growth, all these have been strengthened. That is, finance capital has been strengthened. Finance capital has strengthened to the extent that I think of it like many other researchers and very well-known scholars, that it is the single most important economic actor in the world. Right? I mean, even the most powerful countries find it extremely difficult to rise to the power of finance capital. Right? And all this has also strengthened the concentration and centralization of capital, much of it. So just to give you maybe two more examples, very quick examples. If you look at the 100 top multinationals of these in the world, of these, 82 are in Western Europe and United States of America. Right? 11 are in Japan, a couple of them in South Korea and so on. So Malaysia, Indonesia, and sort of China, each one of these accounts for only one. We had one in India also in the top list of 100, but that multinational shifted its headquarters to Belgium, ArcelorMittal. Okay. So of the top 100, basically you're saying that Global South has almost nothing. Take one more stats to put things in perspective, to understand the nature of concentration of economic power and so on. If you look at the Fortune list of top 100 economic entities in terms of the revenue that they get, okay, so in terms of ranking them in terms of their total revenues, 100 most powerful economic entities in the world, 71% of these are multinational corporations, only 29 are countries. Only 29 are countries in the list of top 100. 71 are corporations. So all this then gives you a very good sense of the larger global structure of contemporary capitalism. What I'm trying to flag for you is that the net result of this has been huge challenges for the world of work in terms of both quantity of work, right? That is labor absorption, employment generation, etc. And indeed, the quality issues. So everywhere we find that what is known as labor market flexibility, that is, make everything flexible, right? Let, in the world of work also, the logic and principle of market rule the roost, right? So there has been a massive increase in the push for labor market flexibility, which means what? Basically, if you again put it in one sentence, it says do away with all regulations, all protection for labor to the extent possible, as long as you can politically make it completely unprotected, do that. But for political reasons, if you have to kind of give them some small crumbs here and there, give them degrees of small protection here and there, so be it. Right? This has been the drift in the global economic system during the last roughly half a century. India was a bit of a latecomer to neoliberal economic reforms. But in any case, when it comes to the world of work here, as all of you know, good 90% plus, even earlier, even before economic reforms, was by and large unprotected. Right? There were very tiny kinds of protection here and there, and even those, for the 90% of the workforce or so, in practice, routinely flouted and not implemented and so on. Even something like minimum wages for agricultural workers and so on, if you look at some of those things, provisions which were there for the informal sector, for the unorganized sector and so on, if you look at that, government's own data will tell you that 85% of workers didn't get that in 1980s. Yeah. So huge percentage. Even when these tiny little elements were there, these were not adhered to, not respected, and so on. So that's the kind of context which we have to keep in mind to come to the labor laws as such. But before I come to that, just one extremely important point which I would like to make, on which you can have discussions further, etc. If we have to challenge this trajectory, there are two things which are extremely important. That how do we roll back this model of neoliberal globalization, right? Now, what could be the ways out and so on, right? Now, rolling it back does not mean that you cut yourself off from the rest of the world, that you become autarkic and so on. No, certainly not. Basically, what could be the playing field on which we can interact with the rest of the globe and so on. So that's one issue. Two, extremely important to emphasize that there must be a balance between the key sector, which is agriculture, and the rest of the economy. Right? In other words, the agrarian question and labor question are very powerfully connected with each other. We have done a lot of work on these issues. Sandeep mentioned the journal earlier. So for an elaboration of these arguments, he will suggest what all to look at. But, labor question cannot be dissociated or divorced from the agrarian question, and which is where a lot of your work is very, very critical. So in terms of, cooperatives, etc., I think that is, yeah. So with that, now let me take 2 minutes just to talk of the kind of labor law regime which is emerging. I've already hinted at that, but essentially the drift of it from 1980s itself was that whatever protection even organized sector workers had, those should be done away with or weakened. That was the broad thrust during 1980s and so on. A lot of debate about why labor laws hurt the workers more than anyone else. That kind of argument was very common, that just do away with all that protection. And in any case, you're protecting a very small segment of workers, tiny segment of workers. And if you do away with that, then automatically everyone will be better off. Now, again, these are arguments which have very little basis, but I don't have time to get into the details of it. What indeed is important to keep in mind is that during that period, that is the pre-neoliberal era, pre-reform period, and so on and so forth, yes, we could have paid a lot more attention to a model of regulation protection for everybody, right? So we really moved in that direction. However, the claim in the recent times has been that, yes, indeed, we are trying to take everyone into account through the changes in labor laws. So that's one point. Second point which I need to make is, see, the way labor laws had evolved in India. Oldest being 1859 Labor Act. So you start from there and then look at how it had evolved. It was basically in the nature of knee-jerk reaction. So something would happen in one particular part of the country and so on. So something applicable specifically to workers in Mumbai, those days, Bombay, of course. But so at different points in time, in very ad hoc manner, for segment of workers, these laws came into being. So there was a lot of patchiness, there was a lot of problem with those laws. It is well known that even something like worker in the labor acts was defined in many different ways. According to some researchers, the organized sector workers were defined in 11 different ways, right? So clearly it was pretty chaotic, and that needed to be addressed, right? FES had actually participated with many organizations here, and they had prepared a draft code way back in early 90s, how to rationalize and improve on this kind of chaos, etc. But I will not get into that subject today, right? Basically, in spite of all these infirmities, or our labor laws, we can say that roughly 40 plus labor laws coming from the domain of union government, and another approximately 175, which are very important within the jurisdiction of the state governments. The idea is to sort of basically do away with most of these, and as a first step, union government labor laws, to be precise, 29 of these have been put into 4 codes, and all these codes, okay, wage code, industrial relations code, social security code, and so on, have been in the conversation for the last several years. In fact, since 2017, wage code was introduced in the parliament in 2017, and thereafter sent to the Parliamentary Standing Committee for deliberation. Subsequently, 2018-19, other codes were formulated, and all these became acts in 2020, although the rules of operation are still being drafted. I'm sure all of you are aware of that. Now, the thrust of all these is to not expand the scope of protection for those who were not protected, right? That is a complete misgiving, in the conversations which happens on these issues, right? And it is to weaken whatever protection that exists. And I'm not saying this, don't take my word for it. If you look at, and this would be my last point, and Sandeep can get into details of the nitty-gritty, all these were sent to the Standing Committee of the Parliament, okay? And if you look at the Parliamentary Standing Committee, which has examined these, and what it says, I'll just mention a couple of these. They highlight innumerable problems, right? But if you look at the overall acts, their concern is that there is large-scale dilution of the existing protective and regulative coverage that were part of the central labor laws. I'm quoting the Standing Committee, okay? There are several other damning observations, with respect to each one of these codes. It states that, for instance, the terms as may be prescribed was used more than 100 times in just one code, that is, exposing basically how ambiguous and flexible the government wanted these codes to remain. So basically saying that the terms as may be prescribed by particular governments, okay, then makes everything, whatever you're sort of suggesting or prescribing as a norm, makes it completely meaningless, okay? So this flexibility and ambiguousness and sort of changing the floor, etc., for whatever some standard coverages that need to be respected. So if we look at all these, we get into a lot of problems there, yeah? So apart from the Code on Social Security, all other 3 codes, for instance, okay, make significant distinction between employee and worker. Yeah, an employee is considered to be in a managerial, technical, and supervisory position, whereas the definition of worker is taken from the Industrial Disputes Act 1947. Right? Now, you make this distinction, and then you propose that very different treatments would be available for them, right? So I can get into many more details, but the sum and substance of it is that the overall objective is to make this architecture of protection much weaker for whoever was protected, and do not take into account those who were not protected. So that seems to be the overall drift of these laws.